Okay, students, this is video 2 of your flipped classroom on the Cold War. This is going to be the Cold War conflicts. We're going to talk about some of the hot spots during the Cold War, so you can put those notes on page 2 of your packet entitled The Nuclear Age, 1945 to the Present, and you can put that information in the second box. All right, so we're continuing our discussion of the Cold War. Why was the Cold War called the Cold War? Well, for starters, it was called the Cold War because both the United States and the Soviet Union had, by this point, nuclear armaments. The United States develops the atomic bomb in 1945. The Soviet Union develops the atomic bombs 2 years later. So now that both the United States and the Soviet Union can basically wipe out single cities and destroy millions of people with a single weapon, any conflict, direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to require the use of atomic and nuclear weapons. So both the United States and the Soviet Union kind of counter move each other to minimize the threat of using these devices. The first of the Cold War conflicts comes over the city of Berlin. All right, Berlin, we know, is the capital of Germany. All right. After World War II, the city of Berlin, just like Germany, was divided. The Soviets controlled the eastern half, while the Americans and the Allies controlled the western half. The Soviets wanted to drive the Americans out by closing off the city. As a result, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the new alliance of countries, was forced to airlift supplies into the city of Berlin. All right. So here's a map of what the country of Germany looks like. All right. I just need you to visualize this. Over here, we have the British sector, the French sector, the American sector. Deep within the heart of the Soviet sector is the city of Berlin. Berlin wasn't in the middle of Germany. It was deep, deep in the heart of the Soviet-controlled sector. And what would happen was the French, British, and Americans would supply the city or the American sector with by car, by truck. However, in the spring of 1947, the Soviets close off the border. So now British, American, and French cannot get into the Soviet sector. So basically, our troops in Berlin, the western part, the free part of Berlin, is completely surrounded. They're cut off. This is what a map of what the city of Berlin looks like. Just like the country of Germany, Berlin is divided, and you have the French sector, the British sector, the American sector, and the Soviet sector. So the Soviets cut off. They don't put up the wall just yet. The Berlin blockade is not the Berlin Wall. So they divide the city of Berlin. They cut it off, and they surround the city. So rather than give up Berlin, the United States decides to airlift the United Nations and give the people in Germany, in Berlin, supplies. So here you have a photograph showing a huge transport planes. What they would do is they would fly over Berlin at low altitudes and they would drop care packages, food, meals, and other supplies to the Americans and the British and the French in those sectors. Now, why didn't Joseph Stalin simply shoot down these planes? They were basically flying over Soviet airspace. Well, the answer for that is had the Soviets shot down an American or a British plane, the United States or the British would have been forced to retaliate, and that would have meant war. That would have meant nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So Stalin doesn't do that. He backs down. And after a year, he opens up the gate to the Westerners in Berlin. And the first of our Cold War crisis, the Berlin blockade, is lifted. And we will come back to the crisis of Berlin very shortly. The next of the Cold War conflicts is going to be in Asia. Okay, communism in 1950 will spread. We talked in the first video about the domino theory. Well, in 1950, a civil war breaks out in China. The United States supports a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. They support him in the election. However, he loses to a guy by the name of Mao Zedong. Right here, Maozedong. And that name will be on your final exam, so make sure you have that down, bullet point it, or star it. And Mao turns the country into the world's largest and newest communist country. And a year later, the Russians give the Chinese nuclear technology. So now two communist countries have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons. And there again is that threat of the bomb. And there's that threat of the domino theory now of communism spreading into Asia. All right. The next Cold War conflict is going to be the Korean War, which was fought from 1951 to 1953. All right. We know that North Korea, or that Korea, the Korean Peninsula, was divided. The North was communist and the South was free. In June of 1950, several months after China became a communist country, the North invades the South, almost wiping out the entire Free Democratic Republic of South Korea. As a result, the United States and NATO rush in to defend the South Korean people. The war rages on for 3.5 years, and in 1953, in June of 1953, a ceasefire was signed. Now, a lot of people think that because it was a ceasefire, the war is over. In fact, the war is still going on. It's the longest ceasefire in U.S. history. And here you guys can see a map. North Korea, or Korea, divided at the 38th parallel. In June of 1950, the North Koreans launch a massive invasion into South Korea. The United States makes an amphibious landing in Incheon, drives the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River, which is the natural border of China. And then, as you can see here, the Chinese support North Korea and they drive back. And for much of 1952 and 53, there is heavy fighting between the 38th and 37th parallels. And finally, in June of 1953, the ceasefire is settled upon where the war began. So today it is a stalemate. And this is an image I love to show you guys. This is an image of North Korea at night. And you guys can see here is China all around the Korean Peninsula. Here is the island of Japan. North Korea, still under a communist dictator, controls what time the people can turn their lights on, what time the lights go off. And here is South Korea, and here's the capital of Seoul, and there's the 38th parallel. And you can see North Korea, this is what it looks like from outer space, is completely dark. All right, our next Cold War conflict is going to be the space race, beginning in 1957. A lot of people think the space race was just curiosity about going into outer space, but it really was a result of the Cold War. Beginning in 1957, the Soviets again take the lead, launching a satellite into orbit. If any of you guys have seen the movie October Sky, that's what that film was about. Sputnik was about the size of a basketball, and there you can see it streaking across our PowerPoint. It's about the size of a basketball, and every 90 minutes it orbited the Earth. And the thinking was, if the Soviets can put a satellite into space, they can send an atomic bomb or nuclear bomb on one of these rockets. The United States responds by putting satellites into space. In 1961, the Soviets put a man into space. 3 weeks later, the Americans put Alan B. Shepard. He becomes the first American into space. And eventually, the space race takes off, and John Kennedy pledges to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, before 1970. And that kicks off the space race. I'd like to show this photo. This is a photograph I took from the Smithsonian showing you what some of the first space vehicles were like. They were very, very tiny, very, very cramped. And this is John Glenn, a model of John Glenn in his capsule Friendship 7. What a lot of people don't realize is that your iPhones and smartphones have about 100,000 times the memory that the original computers on board these spacecrafts had. And these were the original 7 Mercury astronauts, Cold Warriors, some of the early space capsules. And again, this was the barnstorming age of the digital age. And some of the iconic images of the first ever spacewalk conducted by Ed White in June of 1964, or excuse me, June of 1965. And then eventually the United States will surpass the Soviet Union, developing the biggest rocket, the Saturn V, which sends men to the moon from Christmas of 1968. Seen here, the crew of Apollo 8, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, Bill Anders. They become the first people to go and explore the lunar orbit, and they take a very historic photograph on Christmas Eve. This is called Earthrise. They're the first people ever to see the Earth as it exists from another planet. And then eventually, in July of 1969, the United States wins the space race when we land on the moon. And the first man to walk on the moon is this guy right here, an American hero, Neil Armstrong from Ohio. He and Buzz Aldrin land in the Sea of Tranquility, and they spend 2 hours exploring the lunar surface before returning to the Earth. And some of the most iconic images of the 20th century are filmed here during the space race. And a lot of technology and inventions we get today is because of NASA and the space race. And we talked about this when we studied exploration. All right, another Cold War conflict, back to Berlin. All right, before we do that, I guess I'll talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1960, the island of Cuba became a communist country, and in 1961 we tried to invade Cuba. That was one of John Kennedy's early political blunders. We tried to secretly invade Cuba and assassinate Fidel Castro. It was a failure, and 3 months later, in 1961, the Soviets again tried to cut off access to Berlin. And in order to halt people, because what was happening was thousands of people were leaving East Berlin to go to the free side, to the western side. So they decided the Soviets put a wall up. At first it was a barbed wire fence, and then they erected a 14-foot concrete wall. And this wall stood as a symbol of the Cold War before it was torn down in 1989. All right, and this is just kind of an outlier of what the Berlin Wall looked like. Okay, you had command towers, then you had fences that kept people out. Then you had the general border and the warning sign, don't cross. Then you had the concrete wall and then the barbed wire. So it was really not just a wall in the middle of nowhere. It was really a kind of a militarized zone that you were forbidden to cross. People in the West could enter in, but people from the East could not leave. And for years, people could not escape the city of Berlin, and the Berlin Wall became a contentious point during the Cold War. And this is just a photograph showing from the western side. You guys can see there's one wall, there's a second wall, and there's the kind of a buffer zone in the middle, which was filled with landmines and barbed wire. And again, this is a photograph towards the end of the Cold War of graffiti on the Berlin Wall. And a photograph taken of people chipping away at the wall in 1989. All right. Next hotspot of the Cold War. This is a big one. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. All right. We said in 1961, President Kennedy tried to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. It was unsuccessful. In order to defend the island, the Soviets sent, for the first time ever, nuclear missiles into Cuba. This meant, I'm going to show you, here we go. This meant that a nuclear missile fired from Cuba could hit anywhere in the United States in a matter of minutes. Within 3 to 5 minutes, a missile fired at Cuba could hit Washington, D.C. or New York. The only major city, really, Seattle, Alaska, and Hawaii, were not threatened. But the entire United States was threatened by this. So we'll go back to our notes. The Soviets sent offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba. And as I said, that meant they could hit anywhere in the United States in minutes. As a result, President Kennedy ordered a blockade of the island and cut off any future shipments. And for 13 days, the world came to the brink of nuclear war, and people really thought that this was it, that the United States and the Soviet Union were finally going to go to war over this. After intense negotiations, what a lot of historians consider John Kennedy's finest hour, the Soviets back down and agree to pull the missiles out of Cuba. And here's a photograph of Nikita Khrushchev here and John Kennedy negotiating at a summit in Vienna in 1961. And here is a photograph taken on October 14th of the original missile bases. This is what was given to Kennedy. It was taken by the U-2 spy planes. This was the evidence that was used that provoked the crisis. And these are a couple other photographs of the missile tanks and missile trailers. And this was the map I showed you earlier. And then this is a really neat photograph. This is a Navy ship that was part of the blockade line, and here's a Soviet tanker, and on this Soviet tanker you can see are the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And basically a blockade is when you cut off ties. So here is this American ship preventing this Soviet ship from reaching Cuba. And this was how close, literally, we came to an armed conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. All right. That's just a photograph of Kennedy and his advisors. I guess we can talk more about that in class. All right. One of the final hotspots of the Cold War is Vietnam. All right. We talked a little bit about this with imperialism. Vietnam was from 1961 to 1973. Before the Iraq War, it was America's longest war. Okay, like Vietnam, North Korea, Vietnam was divided between North and South, and in order to prevent the spread of communism into South Vietnam, the United States slowly sent men into South Vietnam. At first, they were sent to train the South Vietnamese soldiers to resist communism, but eventually, the United States found itself fully committed. And then throughout the later part of the 60s, we became very heavily involved in Vietnam. And by 1973, the United States, realizing that there was no end in sight, we were forced to withdraw because of the unpopularity of the war. And as a result, in 1975, South Vietnam collapsed. Vietnam is united today as a communist country. And as a result, roughly 58,000 Americans died in this conflict. And it was one of the darker days in American history. And these are some of the images. This is a Buddhist monk protesting the war. Set himself on fire. That was in the fall of 1963. And you can see this is a map just showing you guys some of the battles of North Vietnam invading South Vietnam using the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And again, you guys will talk all about this in U.S. history too. You'll spend a substantial amount of time talking about this. The big military invention during Vietnam was the use of the helicopter. We said during World War II replaced the horse. That's the tank. Also, the use of biological warfare, napalm, to kill crops and vegetation was also used quite heavily. Just some more of the images of the war. All right, and we're going to hold up there because this next slide deals with the conclusion of the Cold War. All right. So if you need any questions or if you need to go back, you can replay this video. Otherwise, you can move on to the next video, which deals with the Cold War ends.